Hello. Hey everyone. My name's Antoine. Came all the way from Australia to talk to you about how we can create effective UI, UX layers on top of Polkadot. As was mentioned earlier by Jack and the ChainSafe team, uh, we're all working towards a vision of a multi-chain future. And we don't believe that there will be one chain to rule them all, or at least we hope that won't be the case as we continue to go forward. So the next question is, how do we prepare for that? How do we prepare for a multi-chain future where networks are all connecting with each other? And what are the problems that we're going to face? I mean, we already have a number of problems that face one chain as it already exists, such as Ethereum. Do those problems compound when we have multiple chains all connecting together? If so, what are they? What are those problems? And if not, why not? You know, well, what does connectivity solve in relation to this? So when we talk about a multi-chain future, I don't want you to just think of it as individual blockchains, you know, sending messages between each other, but they remain relatively static in how they function. What's been introduced, especially with Polkadot now, and a number of other projects going forward, is this concept of governance, or at least on-chain governance, where networks are constantly evolving, constantly changing by virtue of the participants within that network. So I don't want you to think of a multi-chain future as a bunch of static blockchains communicating with each other. I want you to think of it as a web of blockchains that are constantly evolving, where a particular chain may be dependent upon another chain, and therefore will have to dynamically respond to a change in that chain. And so it's more like a living network that's constantly changing, constantly evolving. And so we need to think of it in these terms. So this is a really crude example of, you know, particularly types of parachains that we may see going forward. What I've mentioned was a web of blockchains, and I think that's what's going to happen going forward when Polkadot releases. At the bottom, you'll see that there's three types of parachains that I've identified that I predict we'll see in the network. The first is a general purpose chain. This is very similar to what we already have with Ethereum, general purpose smart contract chains. We have another one called Edgeware that will be one of the first ones to connect as a parachain when Polkadot launches. Again, it's meant to serve very general purpose and is not designed for a particular use case. We'll then have specialized chains, also called dApp chains, that will be particularly configured for a particular functionality or a particular dApp and will be streamlined for that purpose. We then have a third category that I'm particularly interested in, one that we call coordination chains, or chains that provide a service to the rest of the ecosystem, a service to the rest of the network, whether that be specialized in terms of connecting different specialized chains or a general chain together and streamlining that connectivity for client-side applications, or more generally where they provide, say, an identity protocol that can then be used by the entire network, so that instead of having an identity for, you know, Ethereum, or an identity for another general purpose chain, or an identity for a specialized chain, we can have one on the coordination chain that specializes on providing identity to the entire network. Another example could be a chain that aggregates data across the network. So as you can imagine, there will be many chains connected to Polkadot, many of which will also have their own governance protocols on top of Polkadot. And so chains that are dependent on that may have issues where that chain has changed and that other chain has not dynamically responded to it effectively. So coordination chains will be an interesting type of parachain that we'll see within Polkadot. So I mentioned this earlier. When we have more chains in the network, are we simply compounding existing problems that exist with chains like Ethereum and Bitcoin and so on? I think that's true to some extent, but the beautiful thing about Polkadot is that it solves many of them natively, and I'll just want to quickly go through them now. So Jack mentioned this idea of pooled security. The more chains that connect together, the more secure they all are. They're not fighting for participants in the network to secure it. Together, they become more secure as a unit. And so I think this helps a lot of new chains that are struggling, usually in their inception or in the first few months of operation, where some chains suffer resets or freezes because there's an issue with the security layer or the number of participants within the network. So that's that's a beautiful part of Polkadot that will be natively provided once it launches, and that does solve a huge problem when we have multiple chains or a vision of many thousands of chains connecting together. Another one is forkless upgrades. So we can imagine already that when Ethereum and ETH Classic forked, that was a big brouhaha in the community. When there have been proposals to create fundamental changes to the way Ethereum operates, there's a lot of commotion over whether there will be community support for that. Polkadot again is proposing forkless upgrades, which will be a huge problem saver. That will solve many problems, especially in a multi-chain network where there are many chains with many governance procedures all looking to upgrade or change down the line. So that's a huge fix. The third one is scalability. So Jack mentioned again, you could have many Ethereum chains, and then that would ensure greater scalability in terms of processing transactions. So Polkadot does solve that by virtue of the many parachains that can connect together. And then interoperability. Instead of having static siloed blockchains, we can now have them pass messages between each other. And that also provides a great utility when it comes to providing also UX, UI solutions down the track. So although Polkadot does a great job on the protocol level of solving many of these protocol level issues, there are still some UX, UI issues that may arise by virtue of having many chains, and that may in fact get worse if we don't prepare for them now, instead of say a single blockchain like Ethereum or Bitcoin. One of which is layered governance. So Polkadot will have its own governance mechanism, and then you can imagine that there will be other chains that will also have their own governance mechanism, and they may host dApps that will also have their own governance mechanism to upgrade their feature set. And so whilst there's already an issue with voter participation on a protocol level, or even on a single dApp level, by having this multi-layered governance, we may see, I predict we may see diminishing participation going up. And as you can imagine, for a multi-chain network where there are many chains all looking to upgrade down the line, to evolve and to develop with the community, it may be overwhelming for many of the lay participants to ensure coverage across the network for particular dApps or chains that are of great interest to them. So I think we can solve this on a UX UI level, or perhaps not solve it, but make it easier for a user to participate on levels that are appropriate or of interest to them. But I think that's a particular UX UI issue that needs to be looked at. So as you can see from the way the blocks are layered, Polkadot's a protocol level, then you have a parachain on top, and then a dApp within that parachain, and user participation I predict will decline as you go up the ladder. And again, that's just only one layer. You can imagine when there's many parachains connected to the protocol level, each with their own dApps, it looks quite burdensome or overwhelming to the end user. In addition to this, I think there'll be quite an issue with user coverage. So how does a user wrap their head around the many feature sets or the many parachain-specific protocols, dApp-specific protocols that will all operate together on the Polkadot network? How can we ensure that the user is able to quickly find, say, a chain that's of particular use to them, or a dApp chain that's of particular use to them? So I think user coverage across the network may be an issue. Again, the second one being chain interactivity. So you may have, say, a particular parachain that's focused on token swapping, a particular parachain focused on creating non-fungible tokens, a particular chain focused on an identity layer. And so when you link them all together, so that a user can, say, trade non-fungible tokens and associate their identity to that may be a complex interaction on the back end. And so how do we make that easier for the user on the front end so that they only have execute one function and all that connectivity is abstracted away from them? The third one is account management. So with many chains, there may be also many account management procedures for each. How do we streamline this? How do we make it unified or cohesive so that the user only has to manage one account, and that will give them coverage across the whole network? And then the last one is, how is a user updated on chain changes throughout the network? Because that will also affect the way they participate. So when chains are interdependent or codependent on each other, and one chain changes, that may affect the way the others operate. So how do we update the user on that? And how do we ensure that their user experience doesn't change dramatically because of this? So the title of this talk was called Abstractions in a Multi-Chain Network. And so I'm going to identify two types of abstractions that we're looking at our team. in our team. And the first is soft abstraction. So how do we mask complex interactions on the client side? And those complex interactions are occurring on the protocol level with parachains communicating with each other and so on. So one of which is a user-curated experience. So if we can create a means by which users can discover dApps chains, and discover dApps within those chains in one interface, they can then select the ones that are of particular interest to them or that would serve their particular needs. So if a user's looking to access, say, a dApp on a general purpose chain, they can select Edgeware, and that will be saved on their dashboard. They can isolate the chains that are of interest to them, and so when we can curate their experience, we, by virtue of their own hands, they limit the amount of information that is available to them, and so they can, focus on chains that they'd like to participate in or that they would like to be actively involved in. So a curated experience, I think, is one of the key ones in terms of this. And so again, this will also bleed into governance. So the user can focus on, say, the particular protocols that they would like to be actively involved in for governance. They can be notified of when proposals are made for those chains that they've selected. And so they're not expected to have wide coverage across the whole network. It would be only those chains that they deem of particular interest to them. And so this is what their dashboard would look like. They've selected, say, 10 chains that they're particularly interested in, and then they can quickly hot swap between them or get notifications in relation to each of them. So that would again streamline their coverage across the network. Of course, there are more soft abstractions that we can look at, but perhaps I'd like to share when we are a bit further down development. But another thing that we're looking at is hard abstractions. How do we even abstract on the protocol level? How do we streamline on the protocol level that can then connect to the client side? So this is masking complex interactions on the protocol level, and we're looking at a few ways of doing this through parachains. So I mentioned earlier this concept of a coordination chain, a chain that provides resources to the entire ecosystem and that other parachains can connect to, take resources from, take data from, or even streamline their interactivity between each other. So the purpose of a coordination chain is threefold. The first one is to ensure meaningful message passing between networks. So currently Polkadot allows arbitrary message passing. If a parachain can be focused on, say, connectivity between 3 core protocols and streamline that connectivity between them, and to make it meaningful, then that would also provide a benefit on the client side, which will enable the user to have a much more streamlined experience when interacting with these different protocols. A coordination chain can also provide resources to the entire network. Say you have a token-curated registry that aggregates dApp chains across the network, and we can have users interact with that and sort them according to that which is most useful, that which is most effective. That resource can then be accessed by the chains across the network. And again, I think of coordination chains more as a service to the ecosystem rather than say a dApp specific function or a general purpose smart contract function. So this is something we're looking at creating. We're looking at creating one of these types of chains. So we're looking at creating persistent and account identity management on a protocol level. And so if the user has one identity, they can use that identity across the network to send transactions between different chains. And so this should streamline the way users interact with multiple chains across the network. We're also looking at creating a curated chain registry that aggregates chain data across the network. And so instead of having, when I showed you earlier about a process through which users can discover chains and add them to the dashboard, instead of having a centralized service where users submit their dApp or submit their chain to a team to look over and then approve of, but before implementing on the front end, we can remove that intermediary and have a token curated registry that's maintained by the community. And so the wallet or browser can then connect to that registry and the user can discover chains through that. The last one we're looking at is governance monitoring, where it's still kind of conceptual at this point. But when you have multiple chains with governance processes all evolving rapidly, how do we aggregate this data? How do we make it easier for other chains to dynamically react to these changes? Perhaps we can aggregate them again in another registry, but again, this is more conceptual. It's something we're looking at down the track. So this is more of an overview of how the soft abstractions connect with the hard abstractions. So at the top we have, say, the Speckle browser, which allows general interaction with the Polkadot network. It looks more like a wallet interface with the addition of the ability to browse different chains and dApps across the network. And it connects to the Speckle parachain, which provides an identity layer across the network, curated registries and data management registries, data aggregate registries, so that the user can quickly identify information across a chain, a multi-chain network. So it has two layers to it to provide effective UX for Polkadot. So I mentioned this already in terms of curated chain registries. So when the user, say, searches a particular chain that's of interest of them, we can also curate categories for those chains that's managed by the community. So instead of having, say, a Google Play Store where Google can dictate what applications are available, accessible and discoverable by the user, we can have a curated registry where the community decides, what's a popular chain, or what's new and noteworthy, or what's of particular interest to a user who's, say, interested in gaming, for example. So that can remove remove intermediaries on that level. So that's it from me. If you're interested in building a parachain for Polkadot, we'd love to hear from you because we're talking to a few teams already about integrating them on a UX UI level. In addition, if you're interested in UX UI and how that applies to a multi-chain network, please reach out to us. That's our Twitter handle. And then you can just flick us an email at hello@speckleos.io. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, at the back. Is there a microphone for him? Yeah, so currently, I should have probably discussed this during the talk. So at the moment, we're currently focused on building the UI layer, so like a wallet browser for Polkadot. And in fact, we've received a grant from Web3 Foundation to build that. We haven't gotten into the nitty-gritty yet on terms of providing identity solutions, but I think ENS is probably the best example in the market at the moment in terms of providing identities for accounts across the Ethereum network. So that's kind of the model that we're looking at, except how do we make that broader for a multi-chain network? So I apologize, I can't get into the yeah, so that's also a possibility. So again, if chains are already looking at, say, focusing on identity protocols, then we can look to work and integrate with them. Well, I guess the idea I was trying to illustrate here is that to provide effective UX across the multi-chain network, there has to be solutions on both layers, and where those solutions are deficient on the protocol level, we'll look to kind of fill those potholes. Yeah. Any other questions? Nobody? Okay. Thanks very much. Again, if you're interested, please reach out, and I'll be around so you can ask more questions if there are any. Thank you.